it's a broadcasting. Yeah, go ahead. Start. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. This lecture was supposed to be done a few weeks back with the brother Glenn Silver, may Allah have mercy on him. When he passed away, we had to put it off. And alhamdulillah, we have two other brothers who are well and able, inshallah, to address this issue, cultural wars in America. Why, as Muslims, we need to be concerned about this issue and to understand our reality. So before we start with this question, I think we need to answer the question, what is cultural wars? The word cultural wars became famous in this country during the election between George Bush and Bill Clinton, when someone by the name of Pat Buchanan, who was a commentator very frequently seen on TV, gave a major speech, because he was also running for the president and he did not succeed. And he said what's going on in America is a cultural war. What's a cultural war? When you have one or more group facing another one or more group in the country, trying to set the agenda, basically the public agenda in the schools, in the courts, in the public domain, in the Congress and beyond. How can you set up a future of this country based on what you would like to see, not what they like to see? From their perspective, what they want to see versus what others. This would affect and have to do with belief, to have to do with behavior, to have to do with future customs and tradition, to have to do with ideology. As an example, prayer in the schools, guns, where do you stand from Qawm Lut, and so on and so forth. So that is more alive now. And inshallah, the two brothers will discuss this issue and shed some light, so that at least as a beginning, we'll have it as an introduction, and later on, inshallah, down the road, we'll discuss some aspect for the people to have it, inshallah, on live YouTube, so people can use it as a reference whenever there is a need for it, being in the schools and the workplace and what have you. So Jazakallah khair, Brother Hassan and Brother Aqil, for taking the initiative.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, jazakallah khair, Brother Hisham, for that introduction. I mean, kind of stole my introduction, but alhamdulillah, it's good, it's all good. Alhamdulillah. As Brother Hisham was saying, culture wars, is this clash of ideas that, come along and they play a big part in the society. And tonight, we're going to try and delve into some of the origins and the key moments and the lasting impact of culture wars. The lasting impact of culture wars throughout history. Where do we begin? If we're going to talk historically about culture wars, there's, of course, some might say, it started in the 60s. Some might say it started, in the 50s, or maybe, the early 20th century. To be honest, from my perspective, and from what I've seen, and just growing up in this country, and not just growing up in this country, but from what I've seen, is that it started. I mean, culture wars have been around forever. I mean, to be honest, culture wars have been around for millennia. I mean, we all had societies where there would be a rogue idea that would come and stand against the status quo. But we're talking about culture wars in America. I guess the crucible of culture wars is actually the period of enlightenment. For me, I mean, that has to be, because I can't think of a war, a culture war that had more of an impact on the entire world than the period of enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a movement that was focused on different approaches to society and the world. It emphasized reason, individualism, humanism, skepticism, and many of these ideas were a direct impact or a direct challenge against the status quo. And the status quo at that time was the church. The church was the authority. The king was a representative of the church, and they were the authority on every aspect of life. The reason the moon went through its phases were based on the authority of the church. The reason the sun shined was based on the church. Everything the church gave the reason. The reason apples fell from the tree, the church gave you the reason for it. And if you thought or discussed an idea outside of what the church deemed the reason, you were a heretic. You were outside the norm. You could be burned at the stake, for thinking that there was something called gravity, believing that there was a reason for the sun having different phases, or the moon having different phases. So the status quo at the time was the church, and that was the authority for every aspect of life, economics, politics, everything. That was the authority. And then there were many philosophers, thinkers that came along and came up with different ideas. They said, no, you can use reason, you can use your mind. This mind has purpose, and we can use it. There was the idea of individualism, the idea of skepticism. We can actually be, skeptical about things. There's nothing that is certain, that is completely certain. We can question everything, even the sand that is in my hand. If there's sand in my hand, is it really in my hand? Well, I can question that. So that was the idea of skepticism. Eventually, this movement went on, and they began to focus on government, on equality, and societal issues that needed some addressing. They felt needed addressing. That needed to be fixed. Some ideas, and they caused influence from the church. The church didn't allow these questions or these ideas because of the influence from the church. So the Enlightenment period really brought totally different ideas. Kind of throwing up on that. Brought a totally different understanding of the world. These new ideas, of course, were challenged, and people, everyone wasn't with it. There were some that were coming with these ideas, many thinkers, philosophers, and people were following them. But there were people who were standing with the status quo, and they were standing their ground. And these ideas, this clash of ideas, led to revolutions. One of the first revolutions was the American Revolution. Many of the thinkers across the Atlantic Ocean, because it started in Europe. These ideas started in Europe, and they crossed the Atlantic Ocean and were able to spread kind of quickly because of the invention of the printing press. So then just print papers and pretty quickly. So many of the thinkers, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, John Adams, and the like, began to use many of these ideas, and they came up with a lot of writings, discussions, and people again began to challenge the status quo right here in pre-colonial America. Well, in colonial America, not pre-colonial. In colonial America, they began to challenge these ideas, challenge the idea of the king in England and him being a representative of God and being, a church being the authority. It also led to the French Revolution. These revolutions, this is what the Enlightenment period came down to. It came down to bloody physical fights. I mean, physical, they began in the streets. They began fighting against one another in the streets, arguing. It started with family members in their homes, people against people in the villages, and of course, it led to the violence of the revolutions. And they were bloody revolutions. With the French Revolution, there was a 10-month period that was considered the Reign of Terror. From September of 1793 until July of 1794, which is only 10 months, it's estimated, and there were different numbers on this, 40 to 50,000 people were murdered by way of the guillotine alone. The guillotine is this large blade that's hoisted and a person is put under it and their head is chopped off. 40 to 50,000 people were killed by this guillotine in 10 months. In 10 months. If you think about that, if we go with the lower number, the 40,000, in 10 months, that would mean 4,000 people were killed by the guillotine per month. Hundreds of people were slaughtered as a result of this clash of ideas. Hundreds of people per day were slaughtered, as a result of this, these clash of ideas. And this was only 10 months throughout the entire revolution. The revolution actually lasted 10 years, from 1789 to 1799. But I just wanted to bring up that Reign of Terror to let you know how vicious it was, how vicious these revolutions became. And we know that the American Revolution as well brought lots of bloodshed as well. One of the things that the Enlightenment period called for was this idea of equality, this idea of justice, this idea of men having equal rights, all men being equal. But while this Enlightenment period was going on, there were millions of people being transported across the Atlantic Ocean who were being enslaved while they were calling for justice, while they were calling for equality, while they were calling for all these good things. At the same time, men, women, and children were being enslaved through the the transatlantic slave trade. And that brings us to really the real cultural war that started on the land of United States, the question of slavery. There were many groups that left Europe and came to the New World. They came for economic reasons. Many of the groups came because they were leaving religious persecution. The Puritans, the Quakers, they were leaving that. They were running away from religious persecution. And there were many Puritans who didn't like the idea of slavery, who got here and they found it and they were appalled by it. And they fought against it. And this was going against what they found, the status quo at the time. But there were some Puritans who, saw that it was profitable, and they upheld it and they supported it, and they were a big part of it. And of course, this led to some real clashes amongst themselves. And the Puritans, that was the Puritans. The Quakers, at the same time, they were, they were based in the northern states like Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, things like that. And they fought against, and they actually banned slavery. This was, something that was totally against. But they didn't just stop there. They wanted the entire country to be without slavery, to go, to have no slavery. So they did, join organizations, form organizations, and that became the beginning of the abolitionist movement. And they were responsible for freeing hundreds, maybe maybe thousands, I'm sure thousands of enslaved people from slavery through their movement. They were instrumental in starting the Underground Railroad. They gave safe haven to many of the enslaved people as they were running away. But they came against people who saw slavery as not just something profitable, not just something that was, something they did. They saw this as a way of life. They saw it as a complete way of life. Slavery had everything to do with their economics, with their finances, with everything they did. This slavery was so important to them. And so they stood their ground. And there were many clashes in the streets, in the newspapers, there were arguments continuously all the way into the halls of Congress. There were verbal discussions, verbal clashes, physical clashes. And like I said, in journalism, in the courts, there was legislation that would uphold slavery. There was legislation that was passed that would help to abolish slavery. So it was back and forth until it came to physical confrontation again, the American Civil War. And the American Civil War saw Americans fighting against their own countrymen, fighting against their own relatives for what many considered their way of life. And they held on to these long-held beliefs, they held on to them. These were practices that they were not going to let go. And we see remnants of that today. People who say, that was a way of life and we're gonna stick to it. And, even to this day, and maybe Brother Hassan will talk about some of that. And so it culminated into the American Civil War. And the American Civil War was bloody. I mean, really bloody. It said that about 620,000 American lives were lost during the Civil War. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot when we think about wars and when we think about, fatalities around the world today. But it was really fascinating to me that that 620,000 lives is equal to the loss of Americans in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. There were more people killed in the Civil War than all of those wars combined. Not more people, I'm sorry, not more people, more Americans killed in that one war than all of those wars combined. And these wars were fought, many of them were fought right in the United States. The war of, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, well, of course, was not foreign America, and World War II was not foreign American. The Korean War were not foreign American, but they lost Americans. And all of them combined was about equal to how many were lost in that one war. So that to me, that's fascinating. I mean, terrible. It's like we see this repeated, once the clash begins and the ideas are clashing against one another, it seems it comes down to violence, to a revolution and violence. After the Civil War, there were, lots of clashes on culture, and the culture about slavery and all those things went into the Reconstruction period and so much more. And we can talk about some of them, but I just want to hit some of the highlights of cultural wars in America. So we're going to move on to the end of, say, the 19th century on into the beginning of the 20th century, which was women's suffrage, the suffrage of women. Suffrage sometimes is misconstrued, or some people understand. I know myself when I was younger, I remember being in elementary school and reading and trying to understand women's suffrage. The words thinking that talk was talking about women suffering, but suffrage is actually a right to vote. So these women were fighting, women began to band together and fight for the right to vote. Because at the time, women could not own property. During from the time of pre-colonial America to colonial America to even after America became a nation, women could not own property. They could not vote. They had no legal rights to their own children. They were just they weren't allowed. In many cases, they weren't allowed to work outside the home. And if they did work outside the home, their wages were a fraction of what men were, working in the same position would earn. So women began to band together, and they began to challenge this idea, this status quo. They began to fight against it, and they organized They put together organizations and all kinds of groups to try and fight this. In 1913, there was a parade in Washington, D.C., the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. And they were just having a peaceful march, a peaceful parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, which, of course, is in front of the White House. And the people that were standing for the status quo were saying women have a place and they need to stay in it, and this is the idea. They began to attack these women. So it came down to major violence. And the police watched. The police were there, but they watched. They allowed them to be attacked. They allowed them to be, brutalized. And because it was an idea that was going against the status quo. And actually, the cavalry had to be called in order to stop the crowds from murdering these women. But many of them had to be hospitalized with major injuries. These women continued their fight. They were arrested. In the beginning, they were just arrested and then freed and allowed to go home or whatever. But as time went on, they continued to get arrested. They began to get prison sentences for peaceful protests. It culminated down to a period when a bunch of women were arrested and brought to a prison, and then they were basically tortured in what is now known as a night of terror. These women, the guards in the prison, tortured the women, and the word got out into the streets, and it started to gain some sympathy amongst people, even people that were against them, because they felt that this was unjust and it was incorrect. So they began to fight it, and it eventually got to a point where there were laws passed in the United States giving women the right to vote. But we know that during the time of the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without even a question, without even a thought, women were always had, their rights, and they had their place, and there was never a question about them having to fight for equality or anything like that nature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals in his noble book, about the place of women and their status in society. Many of these women, they didn't just have ideas of just wanting to vote. They wanted to clean up society, and they actually blamed alcohol for domestic abuse, for poverty, for so many things. They blamed the use of alcohol because they saw the evils of alcohol in society. So they started, many of these same women, many of the same women who, started with the women's suffrage were a part of this movement to ban alcohol in the country. And this became known as the movement for prohibition, to prohibit the use of alcohol or the manufacturing of alcohol in the United States. And it was a tough battle, a very tough battle, but it did come to fruition. And prohibition was a nationwide ban on the sale and import of alcoholic beverages that lasted from 1920 to 1933. This was another cultural war. There were people who were for and people who were against it. And each one dug their heels in, and they fought for these things. But the prohibition won. The prohibition won. And it was spearheaded by Protestants, progressives, by women, by so many people. And it led to, even though it seemed to be such a good idea to many, what happened was the exact opposite. It began to have ill effects on society. Organized crime went through the roof. I mean, it blossomed into so much. Organized crime and its corruption, it leaped enormously. Gangsters, famous gangsters became really important, figures in America. Al Capone, well, maybe I shouldn't even mention his name, but he was known to make about $100 million a year off of the sale of alcohol. That's about $1.5 billion in today's money. So there was like incredible, and they didn't just get this money or get this, or have this stuff. They had to fight for it, and they fought other gangsters. And murder went through the roof. They would murder each other. Blood was running through the streets. I mean, some of the things that you read about the time of Prohibition is incredible, about the violence that went on. So again, we see this repeating thing. These clash of ideas often come down to major violence. And we know that there was prohibition in the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but this Ummah was able to get rid of alcohol in society with one ayah. There were three, of course, that came in stages. We know the 3 stages it came in, and then with one ayah, it was over. It was over. Because of the connection to the Creator, because of La ilaha illallah, because of that, and because of what it didn't come from one man's thought or a group or organization's idea. It came from the wahi, and we know that. And as a result, there were no problems. There were no problems. Of course, there were individuals here and there that still, did things, but that was handled. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even gives us the answer on how to deal with those things. But this continued for 13 years, this murder and the corruption. I mean, it is also said that same person that was making $100 million a year, he would spend $50,000 a month bribing the police to keep doing what he was doing. To keep selling the alcohol. So it was a lot of corruption. The police were corrupt. The judges were corrupt. The Congress was corrupt as a result of prohibition. So it became a movement, again, to go against that, to repeal prohibition. And so it was repealed in 1933, and prohibition ended. Alhamdulillah. I mean, the murder, and a lot of it was ridiculous. After that, we had World War II. We had, past World War I, World War II, and after World War II, there was lots of prosperity in the United States. Well, we went through the Depression. The United States went through the Depression and then moved into World War II. And after World War II, there was lots of prosperity, lots of money, and there was the GI Bill, and there were so many things that were going on, and people were able to, first generation people were able to go to college and all these things, and this led to the Beat Generation. These children grew up in a society with lots of prosperity, and they had the luxury of questioning everything. They had the luxury of questioning. They hated the idea of this consumerism. Whenever there's prosperity in the United States, lots of consumerism, just buy. And it was engulfing the U.S. at the time. And people began to reject it in the 1950s. They began to believe in self-expression. They began to use literature. They began to get involved in this new music, improvised jazz and things of that nature. And they were, considered beatniks. they were set on breaking down or challenging taboos. If it's taboo, why not? Why? Let's try it. Why do we have to get married? Why can't we, have, these intimate relations without marriage? Why do we have to do all of these things? They would challenge the taboo. Again, they were challenging the status quo. They were challenging the church. They were challenging spirituality. And a lot of their experimentation into these taboos was fueled by drugs, by, LSD and other psychedelics. It was an idea of let's break down all of the barriers of society and let's challenge all of them. And then we had the baby boomers, who they were basically, and many of them were baby boomers, and they were in college campuses and they were trying to organize against. Now the Vietnam War was starting, and they would challenge the Vietnam War. They challenged everything. They were just wanted to chop down all of the barriers in society, which takes us into the 60s. And the 60s was pretty much considered, after the beatniks, who were challenging all of the constructs of society, they were now they were considered a counterculture, just against culture altogether. And it began in the 60s. It was also called a hippie movement. The hippies, they rejected everything mainstream. They experimented with the relationships, with the music, with the drugs, with everything. They tried to dress in the most unorthodox way that they could. They didn't want to dress in the business suits and the ties and, and a neat haircut. They tried everything to be against anything that was mainstream. They were completely counterculture. In this period of time is also the social movements, and I'm going to stop very shortly. I probably promise I'm going to end right now. This moved to a lot of social movements in the 60s. Let's see. At the start of the 60s, the issues in society became starker. These included civil rights for African Americans, the U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, feminism, and LGBT. The civil rights movement was really challenging the idea of citizenship, of the right to vote, the right to be a human being in this country if you were other than a Christian, other than a white person, other than basically the status quo. So they were challenging all of these ideas. At the same time, there were people who had these values of peace, like the Enlightenment period. They had these good ideas, and then they said that peace, love, tolerance, and they, let's just love everybody. Everybody's fine. Everybody's good, and people are inherently good, and they'll, even if they do something that's out of the, off, they'll eventually come back to that which is good. And so they had this idea of just love everybody. And the mainstream didn't do well with these ideas, with the civil rights movement, with the feminism, with the LGBT. So it came down to violence. Again, there were public beatings. I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen the pictures, have seen the videos of dogs being, sicked on peaceful protests, arrests for civil disobedience, police brutality, and it came down to riots. There were riots in the 60s that were just incredible. In 1967, which was considered the long, hot summer, there were riots in Atlanta, in Boston, in Cincinnati, Buffalo, Tampa, and that was in June of 67. In July of 67, there were riots in Birmingham, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Minneapolis, in Milwaukee, Newark, New Britain, New York City, Plainfield, Rochester, and Toledo, Ohio. And when I say riots, I mean entire neighborhoods would be flattened from these riots. The fires, the looting. I mean, these neighborhoods would be destroyed, just completely destroyed. We're not talking about just a bunch of people fighting. We're talking about real destruction. It led to violence. In 1965, there was something called the Bloody Sunday, where people were making a peaceful protest to cross the Edmund Peterson? You might remember Edmund Peterson Bridge. Okay, wait. There was this bridge in Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama. And they were crossing this bridge to bring attention to the idea of black people not being able to vote, or having to pass literacy tests, or having to pay a poll tax in order to vote. This is to bring attention to this idea. And the state troopers assailed them and just beat them mercilessly. And it was all on camera. And this led to some sympathy for the civil rights movement, which, brought, and there was a lot more than just the Bloody Sunday, but this brought on a lot of sympathy for the civil rights movement, and it brought about legislation that came about later on. I mean, there were so many lynchings because they were fighting against the people who were challenging the status quo, who were challenging the way of life. So people were being lynched on a regular basis. But I'm taking up too much time. I'm going to stop here. Jazakallah khair.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, wa tabi'a bi ihsanin ila yawm ad-din. So, Brother Akil took you through the tour de force of the origins of Western civilization, and growing up as a Muslim in this country is very confusing because you think that the people around you grow up in a certain deen with certain principles, certain ways of looking at life, certain things you have to do, you don't do, certain morality and ethics and values that you're taught. And then you see the people around you and you think, well, these are we're Muslims, they're Christians, they're Jews. They must have their own set of principles and values based on their religion. But in fact, when you don't learn about this whole reality of this struggle that's happened in the West, you don't realize that, in fact, they are really not upon their religion. That religion lost its intellectual battles. They're literally battles, as Brother Akil was saying. People died in the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions, and these were battles, both physical and intellectual, that their deen has basically lost. And so what you're seeing around you is a way of life in which there are churches, people go to church, but in reality the church is not telling them anything about the reality of living life. It's boiling it down to a few simple things. One thing you may have heard of is something called the Protestant work ethic. It's a kind of a value system that Protestantism, so of course we have in Christianity, we have Catholics, they follow the Pope, and then we have the Protestants who don't follow the Pope, and they're a mixture of groups. So you can't say, there's what they are, but they don't follow the Pope. They don't have a hierarchical authority through the Pope. Now they may have it through a different mechanism. But basically, the value system that this country had was that work is the most highest virtue. In other words, work and productivity is the deen. In other words, that becomes a kind of virtuous activity, a higher moral standard that people are striving for. So work is by itself a kind of ibadah, and maybe the principal form of ibadah for the people of this country. And so we see today this translated into a type of Christianity which they call the prosperity doctrine. There's these churches, mega churches. What do they preach? They preach that you should get rich. And that if you are rich, it's because God wanted you to be rich. And He wants you to be richer and richer. And so it's a kind of a positivism but it's preaching about wealth in a way that you would think if you said it in the masjid, you'd be like, this person is crazy, he needs to be locked up. But in the church, it became the principal value that they're preaching to their clientele, and it is why they, this sense amongst themselves of snake oil salesmen. These people, they don't mind that their preacher has, $100 million house and 6 private jets, and because he's saying to them, this is what God gave me, and He wants you to have all these things. So, in essence, they're justifying their own corruption through their commitment to this kind of value. So, I want to start that off because, this is kind of understanding what is the baseline of what is existing in this country. And as far as culture wars, as Brother Akil mentioned, the culture war has been going on since the Enlightenment, but in the modern sense, what we were talking about is after Christians lost the battle over prohibition, there was also several other battles. There was a battle over evolution. There was a Scopes trial, which is the state of Tennessee sued or tried to imprison this fellow who was a teacher who was teaching evolution because there was an act in Tennessee that said banned the teaching of evolution, the Butler Act. And they lost, they won the trial. He got like $1 fine and he was let go. But the point of the matter was that after that, even though they lost, it was, the guy lost the trial technically, but after that, basically, the remnants of this sort of Christian doctrines that were governing some semblance of life in the country really kind of faded away. And so you had all these movements that came, the hippie movement, the people in the 70s and so forth. And what we have is we fast forward to the 60s, and you see all the hippies out there. They're burning their bras, they're using drugs, they don't believe in marriage. They call the person who is believing in traditional values, they call them a square. Like a square is it's a very rigid kind of geometrical shape, right? But that means you're not flexible. You're just kind of stuck in an old time. And so we had in response certain preachers that came about, and they made a big difference in terms of the political sphere. And in fact, much of what they talked about is just repeating itself over and over again. Every few years, we have the same thing happen again and again. Culture war, as Brother Hisham mentioned, was a term, but is actually coined by a sociologist, James Hunter. He wrote a book, Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. But the time was correct. It was the same time in 1991. And what he made, his point was that we can maybe have political disagreements, but a culture war, you either have to win it or you lose it. You can't have a compromise on a culture war. In fact, he said culture comes from Latin, and it means something sacred. It's like an overarching value. It has to dominate everything. That's what culture does. And you can have either one culture or another culture. You can't have two cultures. Many times today we say, people say we have two sets of facts, and we have fake news, we have real news. Everyone has trying to set up their own set of facts. Why? Because they are trying to set up the own basic understanding of life. And what are the facts? And in fact, this is the struggle that's going on right now. We had in Congress they were having this hearing on this bill. It's for pediatric residency. When doctors go to train, their hospitals, they train the doctors after they graduate from medical school. But the federal government pays the hospitals for that training. And so they have to renew that every so often. And so what's happening now is that there's actually a fight because some of the Republicans have put in a kind of a rider onto that, that they want to ban any residency program of pediatrics from having any kind of gender transition program. And so in fact, you see in that hearing today, there was one lady, she says that gender transition is a settled fact of science. And the next lady who comes in says, biological sex is a settled fact of science. And the other lady is talking about, nonsense. It's nothing. It doesn't have any scientific basis. It's just a theory. And so the reality is that this is what the fight is about what are the facts, what is the reality, what is the basic assumptions that society will use to judge people. In other words, this became a fact over the last few years, what we call cancel culture, right? So cancel culture, it basically used a public kind of forum to judge people and say these people are unwanted people, and we need to get them out of their jobs, out of their public sphere, whatever, the guy who had MyPillow, the company, we need to destroy his business, because of what he said. So in essence, it's a way of making a determination of who is right, who is wrong, who is allowed to speak, what are they allowed to speak. And that is really what this culture war is about. So a couple of people I wanted to mention, so there was a fellow who grew up in rural Tennessee. His name is Jerry Falwell, Sr. He has a son, Jerry Falwell, Jr. But a very famous fellow. He started a movement. First of all, he had the first mega church in the United States. It's called Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. But he started what basically became the paradigm of modern Christian kind of political leaders. He started a PAC, a political action group called Moral Majority. And he also had a radio station, Old Time Gospel Hour. It spread his message throughout the country. He became famous. And then he later started a university, at Liberty University. So that's also his university. And he became famous because he helped to elect Ronald Reagan to office. It was through his help and the evangelical Christians, which are a branch of Protestantism, that he was able to be elected. And in that sense, he stood for a few things. So one thing, we talked about prosperity. So it's a strange mixture of what is the culture on one side. So in the sense, he's a Christian preacher, right? He's supposed to be a religious fellow, but he says that giving away things, meaning welfare, he says it's developing a breed of bums and derelicts who wouldn't work in a pie shop eating holes out of donuts. Meaning that if we give people welfare, they won't do any work. What does this have to do with Christianity? After all, he's a preacher, right? This sounds like something more like the Republican Party might say. But as you see, the blurring of the two sides of religion and politics. But it came from this previous thing that I talked about, the Protestant work ethic, the idea that there's some moral compass that people need to work. They ignore some of the other things about charity that are in the Bible, but they emphasize these aspects. He talked about AIDS is not just God's punishment for homosexuals, it is God's punishment for the society that tolerates homosexuals. So he was very ardent against homosexuals. He called this lady who identifies as a lesbian, Ellen DeGeneres, he called her Ellen Degenerate. He was very famous because she's a famous person, and he used to talk against her as well. He was a very ardent Zionist. So you see, he is also kind of where this was established, this allegiance between evangelical Christianity, the Republican Party, and Zionism. He very ardent against Islam. So again, some of the things which Trump frankly was, he was good at knowing what to say to people to make them happy, but he didn't really have any intellectual basis behind his thinking. The thinking came from much earlier. They were the ones who established this kind of nexus between all these groups to join together. And they were against desegregation. And so Jerry Falwell was very famously a very ardent opposition of desegregation and against African American rights. He was very strongly opposed to Martin Luther King Jr. And so you see what are the same things we see today in the modern, the groups that are together. the white nationalists, the Zionists, the evangelical Christians, the capitalists, the people who were more strongly pro-business, and he was ardently anti-homosexual at that point, but later on he actually went back on that. So in fact, you see all of these strange group of people together in one side. On the other side, you have liberal Catholics. You have people more industrialists of the North, the same old divide of the North and South in terms of the Civil War. You have the minorities, so we have African Americans in particular on that side, and then Hispanics, and of course, we unfortunately decided to join, many of us, on that side of the culture war. And so you can see why, because you see in the sense where people are threatening you, Trump created a Muslim ban. Bush was locking up people right and left, Guantanamo Bay, creating new kinds of ways to punish people, and particular focus against Islam and Muslims. And you see the natural inclination for people, for us, to join on one side or the other side of this war that's happening for culture. So we fast forward now to today, and we have a new culture war. But, as you can see, the echoes are there from the same exact playbook from the old days. In fact, even now, we have, we have this trans movement, right? And who are the people supporting it? Mostly on the Democratic side, progressive movement. But in fact, you have many homosexuals in the Conservative Party who are against them. They're very interesting, and that is because of this alliance from the old days. In fact, who's also on the one side of the culture war with the evangelicals? So we have evangelicals, right? They're head of national Christian movements. Who is their allies? Atheists. It was strange but true. Because the atheists, in fact, they say, some of the prominent atheists, they said, yes, we're against religion, but we're really against Islam. They're very clear about that. They said, the other religions, they don't really believe in what they're saying. Islam and Muslims, they really believe they are the real danger and the real threat. Of course, many of these atheists are also pro-Zionists as well. And it's very convenient for a Zionist to also be, focused against Islam. So you see the overlapping groups that are together. And so why, and then it makes some sense now, why, a homosexual atheist would be defending evangelical Christians. It doesn't make any sense from an ideological perspective, but because they've come together as one side of this war, that's why, you find them there. You had this guy, I don't want to mention his name, but he was a Greek, from a Greek background. He was very, openly identifying as homosexual, but he was also constantly defending, white culture, European culture, Protestants, Judeo-Christian culture. He was constantly talking about these sorts of things, even though he's an atheist and so forth. So now we have, to today, we had these movements that started. They were frankly very different in some ways. We had the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement, it really was an online movement where you had a lot of women who said, we were sexually abused by these people for years, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we didn't say anything because we thought we couldn't have any voice. And now they started saying something. So people, very famous people, suddenly they're losing their jobs. They're in court. Bill Cosby, who was the face of the American family, not just everybody, all the family, and he became arrested in jail for sexual assault. So there's a very dramatic change. People felt that, the assumptions, the people that we are holding on high pedestals, suddenly somebody's out to get them. And who are these people? they're saying that these are the progressives that are trying to cancel everyone, everybody, for problems that they had for years. And then you had on the college campuses, people suddenly, they're not allowed to speak. Certain conservative voices, they were disinvited. There were riots, people trying to stop them from talking. If certain conservative voices would talk too loudly, they would lose their job, they would be fired. So you had, in fact, these terms that people started inventing called, microaggression. And that means that you kind of said something to me which triggered me, and I've been triggered by these kind of negative comments, and so it's not like one aggressive movement, but all day long, all month long, I hear all these negative comments against me. It becomes a kind of microaggression. Or they had something in college campuses which they called trigger warnings. Before you start the lecture, you have to tell people, I may talk about something that might, cause you some emotional distress. So now we need this called trigger warning. And so the college professors also became upset because of this new kind of cultural dogma that was being foisted on them. So in fact, that also became another source for this new culture war to start. There was a book written, The Coddling of the American Mind. Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist, and Greg Lukianoff, he's a lawyer, that kind of pushed back against this. And then you had this new organization, it's called FIRE, which is actually promoting free speech and trying to push back against some of these kind of attempts to cancel or stop people from speaking. And of course, on the backs of this kind of war, now we have the new Republican candidates who are, some of them are frankly, you hear today, you see atheists talking in positive ways about Muslims. What a strange thing. But why? Because they're saying that, Muslims are standing up to the people with the transgender ideas, right? And suddenly, people are joining these people who are talking positive about us. But again, the reality of our situation in this country is that both sides, frankly, want to use the Muslim community, and whenever they find us convenient, they start to promote, reach out to us, and whenever they find it inconvenient, suddenly, we're rejected from their circles, and it is unfortunate that people from our community, they become foolish and they start going to one side or the other side as a form of, wherever the current wind of the culture is, you kind of start following that direction. So I think there's a lot more to be said on this topic. Maybe we can do more on that in the future. But I wanted to at least stop here so we have some time for questions, as time for Salah, inshallah, is also coming. سبحانك اللهم نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. بسم الله. I don't know, Brother Akil, if you had anything you wanted to add, but.
Yeah, I think you got it. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
The gender of the newborn until later on when they decided themselves, or that's a rumor?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the official position of some of the pediatric organizations. There is this thing where they've, the trans movement people, they want you to call not just gender, they're saying that gender assigned at birth, meaning that, we don't know if somebody's a boy or a girl when they're born. The doctor just says he's that way, and then later on they discover what they are. In fact, this became a kind of ridiculous idea, but frankly, I would say it's ridiculous, but people are, losing their jobs over these things. People are in court cases where they're getting arrested for saying the wrong thing. So, it sounds to us to be very silly, but in fact, it became a new dogma. And so, on the one hand, people, literally, people are saying to themselves and to the whole society and this nation that this is settled science. This is the new science. Not just something that they're asserting. This is absolutely settled. And on the other hand, of course, people are saying, well, we had millennia. I mean, it's obvious what's a boy and a girl. So what are you talking about? But.
Good question. Excellent question. I think the where we stand is the same place that our forefathers stood. We have to stand for La ilaha illallah. We have to stand for establishing Islam on earth and bringing the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, making the law of the land the law of Allah azza wa jal. I mean, that like Brother Hassan said, he said a culture is something that dominates. There aren't two cultures and there aren't two deens. They don't coexist in the same place. They have to, you can't have, it just doesn't happen. You don't have two deens and you don't have two cultures. One dominates. And those people that have a culture, that have a way of life, they need to work towards it. And our culture is Islam. Our way of life is Islam. And we have to, and when it comes to these cultural wars, that becomes our stance. That Islam is to dominate. And Allah knows best.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. Obviously, it probably take longer than this to answer. But you're asked basically where do we stand as Muslims in the culture war? And of course, we've been victims of the culture war. Now people want us to be allies in the culture war. I think there's a lot of ways to look at it. I think we're trying to promote what is khair, and so if there's a methodology to do that by aligning with people to promote certain or prevent certain laws from being enacted, certain legal penalties for believing in La ilaha illallah and on our message, then I think certainly there is some scope for alliance on that, on those kinds of things to avoid greater fitna. Again, I don't think it makes sense to me to be wholeheartedly aligned with one group or another group because of the nature of these shifting allegiances and alliances, and that naturally politicians are going to use religion and not support religion. They use us for their purposes and then abandon us. So I think we need to be aware of that. But at the same time, we are unfortunately find ourselves in a position where people may be in a position where they lose their children to social services if they establish Islam in a certain way, and it comes to the attention of the authorities. Already people have been arrested in Canada. This fellow was arrested for just saying the wrong pronoun, and so I think there's definitely a need for us to stand up as Muslims. As I was very appreciative of our scholars for this Navigating Differences document that they circulated against this kind of ideology to promote what does Islam say as a form of legal defense and a position that we can argue for going forward. But again, Malcolm X says by any means necessary. You have to promote the deen. And I would say by any legal means necessary, we need to establish, stand up for Islam and stand up for what we believe in based on Islam, not on allegiance to any other ideology. Yeah. Barakallahu fikum. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Subhanakallah. Barakallahu fikum.